everyone. Today, we're going to cover a pretty well-known place that pretty much everybody learns about in school, but we're going to take a look at it now with new eyes. There are several out-of-place architectures around the world that have the same stale story of being carved out of stone. But could this just be a cover story for something much bigger? Perhaps some sort of technology or event that has been removed from our history. You see, if we knew that it was possible for ancient structures to become stone, we would see rock formations with a whole new perspective. We would begin to see the massive size of ancient organisms or ancient structures that seem to be far beyond what we're told the ancients were capable of. I would say that this information is obscured because it would call into question the entire story of humanity. Stories that many people and governments are very invested in. When we think that these ruins are many thousands of years old, it sort of removes us from the whole situation. It's not something we think we need to think about, but if it's the case that something happened in our recent history, let's say a few hundred years, then who's to say it can't happen again? If it's the case that much of the ancient architecture are petrified remains, then how did it become that way? What was it before? So let's begin this thought train with taking a look at Petra, one of the most famous examples of magnificently carved architecture completely out of stone. Let's start with the mainstream narrative. Petra is a famous archaeological site in Jordan's southwestern desert. Dating to around 300 BC, it was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, accessed via a narrow canyon called Al-Sik. It contains tombs and temples carved into pink sandstone cliffs. Perhaps its most famous structure is a 45-meter high Al-Khazneh, a temple with an ornate Greek-style facade and known as the Treasury. It seems to revolve around these Nabateans. Who were they? 1. The city was originally known as Rakhmu, the Recum of Josephus, and notice how he comes up again. Is this another cover story by this historical figure? 2. The Nabateans made Petra their capital in the 2nd century BC. 3. Petra flourished in the 1st century AD, and in that period the famous Khazneh was built, thought to be the mausoleum of King Aretas IV. 4. In 106, the Romans annexed Nabatea and renamed it as Arabia Petrea, with Petra as the capital. 5. An earthquake in 363 destroyed many of these structures. 6. A smaller Petra survived in the Byzantine era, in which the Christian churches were built, but the city was abandoned in the early Islamic era. 7. The ruins remained unknown to the world until they were discovered by Burckhardt in 1812. Which is really strange that we have this similar story of a lost city with Petra, just like with Pompeii. Quote, the first European to describe them was the Swiss traveler Johann Ludwig Burckhardt during his travels in 1812. At that time, the Greek Church of Jerusalem operated a diocese in Al-Karak named Batra, and it was the opinion among the clergy of Jerusalem that Karak was the ancient city of Petra. End quote. The Scottish painter David Roberts visited Petra in 1839 and returned to England with sketches and stories of the encounter with local tribes. The archaeologist Philip Hammond from the University of Utah, USA, has visited Petra for nearly 40 years. He explains that the local folklore says it was created by the wand of Moses when he struck the rock to bring forth water for the Israelites. If we take a look at the map of Nicholas Sanson of 1654, we see clearly that Petra is labeled in other names such as Herat or Rahat. Now, with this name of Petra Heratum, Herat, or Herrick, we can find other sources. Quote, in the Dutch Historical and Geographical Dictionary of David van Hoogstraten, 1725, Arabia Petrea has its name from the city of Petra, which is now called Herrick because she was built on living stone. From Charles Mattey, Dictionary Geographic Universal 1701, Mattey says that Herat has an archdiocese which depends on the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Thesauruses Geographicus, 1695, quote, Arabia is at the origin of several sorts of people. chiefly of the Saracens, Arabians, and Moors. Their chief cities are Herat or Petra, Median, Milan, and Havana." End quote. Diderot Encyclopedia entry Petra, quote, "Arabia, Petrea, has been called this way after its ancient capital Petra, which is now called Herat." Now, is it possible that there was some world cataclysmic event in the 1690s that melted many of these cities in the surrounding region, melting many of the structures in a Sodom and Gomorrah type event? Part of the reason that many of these structures are so pristine is maybe there were cliffs or even more ancient petrified buildings upon which a later civilization founded and built upon. We must also consider that many of these structures were refined in order to create tourism traps in the modern day. It is the symbol of Jordan, and just in 2019 alone, 1.1 million tourists came to see the attraction. Just like other sites around the world, these structures have been tampered with and cleaned up. It's also interesting that the Treasury building has many common motifs seen in Freemason architecture from the 17th century. If we look at the Basilica de Santa Maria Elche in Spain, you can clearly see the similarities. Nabatean art is clearly Greco-Roman and looks to be less than 400 years old. The seemingly antique Greco-Roman style of Herat is to be compared with the style of Pompeii, equally destroyed in the 17th century, and with a very large amount of classical beginning Baroque style buildings of the years 1650 to 1700 in France or Belgium. We can imagine that this great catastrophe of 1695 has been eliminated from standard history for religious reasons. A God destroying great parts of the Christian Islamic world could not be accepted. God was maintained, real history was put aside. Now, we do see evidence of melting throughout Petra caused by some great heat, but the question remains, was it some event caused by a god or natural occurrence? Or maybe there was some type of magic or technology involved. In our Tartaria Explained on petrification, we went over the horn of Pope Cornelius. Quote, "A legend told at Karnak states that the Karnak stones were once pagan soldiers who were turned into stone by Pope Cornelius who was fleeing from them." End quote. If we look at the engravings of this site, we can see the massive amount of stones that were once there, giant in nature. But when we look at the site today, you can tell these stones have been manipulated and or destroyed. Yet, you can still see how massive this site once was. Even in the paintings of Pope Cornelius, we can see the magical horn that was said to cause petrification. Just think about it. It's literally called Petra, or petrified city perhaps? There are other devices that could have made this event happen on purpose, Such references are actually commonly known, such as with the Horns of Jericho or the Ark of the Covenant. Did we possess advanced cataclysmic technologies within the last 500 years? These could have been used as tactics of war and/or enslavement to get rid of other advanced races. Perhaps some of these caves were in fact dug out in many of these locations as the outside was being burned with extreme high temperatures. Also, in Indiana Jones: The Last Crusade, they use Petra as the place where they find the Holy Grail. Now, this has many meanings, especially since it's been picked up by religious doctrine, but in medieval texts, it seems that the Holy Grail was some type of magical device or sangreal that gave the user special abilities. Similar to the horn, the Holy Grail could have been a philosophical stone or alchemical device that possessed the ability to manipulate objects in the material realm. Either or, the fact remains that there is clear evidence of melting within these structures. Here we can see what looks to be melted pillars in a cave that is below a pristine temple, which most likely has been modified and updated in recent times. I mean, just look at the surrounding area. Are we to simply assume this is the result of erosion? Looks kind of like a candle to me. Why are some areas extremely pristine and then others look as if they carved dilapidated forms into rocks? It goes against all common sense to build in this fashion. Not all the Greco-Roman looking structures are in such good condition, as you can see what looks like extreme weathering and these strange patterns on the walls. So another interesting aspect to all of this is that there are a bunch of old engravings of Petra, and there's one that seems to show that it was completely underwater at some point. There are also other engravings depicting other structures such as an ancient bridge. Of course, this doesn't exist now as it was destroyed by earthquakes and floods. So how much more was lost over time? Another thing to consider is this whole blackened buildings phenomena that is seen with buildings around the world. This would probably make for a really great video on its own, but we can see the same situation in Petra. You have this clean, bright rock on the temples, and then the cliffs look as if they've been burned or have gone through some great heat of some kind. Also, what's with these cliff faces? Are we to assume that this is simply all natural? Or is this a part of an even greater structure that may be even more ancient? In order to enter Petra, you have to go through this Sikh Gorge, which is supposedly a natural gorge, but there are underground aqueducts that would bring water into the city. Even the mainstream narrative admits that these people created cisterns and dams throughout the city. It does seem to be pretty advanced considering the harsh environment, and it just makes me question whether this is actually natural or man-made. The theater is extremely suspicious since it really doesn't make sense to construct architecture in this fashion, but they also say it was used as a necropolis, which seems more like a newer story that was constructed to hide what the site really was, a massive city, but nobody actually knows what the purpose of all these rock structures were, so of course, they tell us the story that they were simply tombs. It really just looks like this area has melted. Everywhere you look along the cliffs, there's evidence of old stairways that lead nowhere, floors and rooms and the remnants of ancient buildings. Many of these rooms have vanished because of this cataclysm and due to recent erosion. Not erosion of millions of years, but within the past couple hundred. There's this awesome website that has a 360 view of Petra. I'll leave the link in the description. This isn't just isolated to Petra. In fact, we see this all around the world, just some places are more severely melted than others. Turkey is filled with this type of stuff. If we look at the Lycian tombs, we see the same Greco-Roman architecture that is supposedly carved into a rock face, yet we see evidence of melted rocks. You can even see how everything looks burnt up. Again, you have the same themes, dating this back to 2,000 years instead of these structures actually being of a much more recent time period. Cappadocia in Turkey is one of the most famous examples, even though when we hear about this story, we more so hear about it in terms of the underground cities. But what if there's a whole other aspect to the story that we aren't told? You have the Uashisar Castle, which definitely looks like some massive melted structure of some kind. I mean, who would build like this? And if you look at some of the rock formations in the area, you get the same candle-like effect. Some areas have these sharp edges and are perfectly refined, and then others look completely unfinished and distorted. Then you have Goreme, which, if you don't think this looks melted, I mean, I'm not sure what to say. But just look at this place. It completely looks melted. Some good examples are what they call the fairy chimneys. Very interesting. What could these have once been? Of course, they love to explain this away by just saying volcanoes and ash that built up over millions of years, erosion. Right, because to me, these look very structural, and when considering the amount of work that was put into supposedly carving them, you would think that researchers would consider whether or not these rock formations are some sort of ancient structures. This whole area is completely filled with underground dwellings, and you can even see pillars with what looks like melted tops, which again gives more evidence to the fact that many of these other rock formations look very similar. Why would they carve such dilapidated forms? Maybe it wasn't designed this way originally, and some event melted the tops to many of these structures, giving it this unique look. Who's to say that these aren't from a more recent time period as well? The entire story really doesn't make any sense. So they carved out all these rocks, lived underground, and then they got cancer due to long-term exposure due to the inhalation of aragonite fibers. Or maybe these were ancient structures that went through some type of cataclysm, and then later peoples came after the cataclysm or while they were still occurring and began to form some of these underground dwellings. But that was not what these structures were initially designed to be, and many of them are not natural as the so-called mainstream experts would like to tell us. This kind of stuff is all over the place. Another well-known example is the Ellora Caves, which would have been a massive project according to the mainstream story. It's also weird that basalt seems to be associated with almost all these places. Sure, they will say because it's easier to carve into, or that volcanoes formed many of these rock formations over millions of years, but we're questioning that mainstream narrative. Let's just keep in mind the tools that we are told these so-called ancient peoples used. I mean, if you ask me, that doesn't really make that much sense. Now, Ellora Cave is quite detailed and well preserved, so it could be said that these peoples possess some type of carving technology, possibly sound-based in origin. However, there is evidence of melted rock formations in this area. Again, we have these stairs leading to nowhere and even the blackened stone phenomena. This looks very similar to Petra in many regards, yet we're in a completely different part of the world. Why would ancients undergo such an overwhelming task to completely carve a building out of a mountain, especially if we consider the tools that they were using during this time period? They love to say, oh, some of these temples were just unfinished, like with Cave 30, but why would they start such a massive project and in some areas, it's perfectly designed and others are rudely constructed and look deformed? What if this is a much more preserved petrification example and this entire mountain was once some massive structure? You can see examples of petrified objects all around India with the same theme. What about the Yampuri cave temple that is completely made of granite? Oh, they just carved this with basic tools as well. There's also many petrified spheres in India. Most famous, Krishna's butterball. which is said to be a huge ball of butter from the gods that had become petrified into stone. It has been attempted to be moved or relocated, but everyone who's tried has failed. Another amazing example that is less known is the Brihadiswarar temple, which is supposedly completely made of granite. Just imagine how massive these stones would have to be to carve out all these different structures. And even if they did manage to move these massive stones, how did they carve them with primitive tools? What's weird is that the Vimanam or Vimana at the top of the temple is said to not cast a shadow. Is this some type of ancient flying Vimana landing station that has become petrified over time? It is the first complete granite temple in the world. Not too many people know about this place. And the material is not native to this area. It is said that there are dozens of underground secret passages all around this site. Evidence shows that there was no granite cutting quarry or even sources to get the stone around Thanjavur. In fact, it is not available even within 50 kilometers of the site. Imagine how they would have to carry it all here to be used in the temple. Speaking of granite, the main Vimana measures 66 meters in height. This is 6 stories high and was the largest structure in South India in those days. The astonishing part about this is that the large granite capstone on the top weighs about 80 tons. This was placed over the hollow Vimana. So how was this done? Supposedly no one knows, or maybe they aren't willing to consider explanations outside of the mainstream narrative. You also have many more sites, for example Elephanta Island, which is very similar to Ellora Caves with the blackened stone. It again looks a part of a larger structure. And another site like this is called Badami Cave Temple in Mumbai. Some of the pillars are actually pretty amazing to be just completely carved out of stone. Maybe there was some type of starting base and it was refined? I mean, why else would they find this area so sacred? Is it because this is actually an ancient building? In China, you have the Longmen Grottos, containing the largest, most impressive collection of supposed Chinese stone carving. The Guyaju caves in China look very similar in their design. But look at the spherical top to the whole rock formation. That doesn't really look natural. Sure, maybe these were used as cave dwellings in recent times, but this looks like a man-made structure that went through a similar event as all these other locations. Then there was that one story of the Longyu caves in China, which seems to be an unsolved mystery as they can't figure out who created this and how. Again, is this connected to petrified ancient structures? As they even tried to claim that these were natural formations when farmers first discovered it after draining several ponds revealing 5 large man-made caverns. Of course, this story is only mentioned when aliens are involved, so we don't consider other implications. Just type in grottos from around the world and begin to look at them with new eyes. For example, in Europe, you see these everywhere. In Spain, you have many of these cave-type dwellings. One that is very interesting is called the Moorish Caves, in which you can see that there are many windows and underground dwellings. You have the Granada cave dwellings, which actually seem to be very well preserved and or built upon in recent times, but it does seem very similar to what we see in Turkey. You see the same melted rock formations, and on the tops of these areas they look very kind of candle-like. Another interesting location in Spain is the Centeno de los Bodegas, which is basically a town under this massive boulder. Which sure, this may not be an example of petrification, but supposedly they constructed this by enlarging natural caves. Was this the remnants of some ancient petrified structure and later civilizations used it to build cities and dwellings? The same phenomena of cave dwellings that seem to be far too advanced for the ancients to simply carve out with primitive tools can really be found around the world. Sure, we can simply stop asking questions and just accept the mainstream narrative. But is there something else going on that our modern day experts simply refuse to consider, as it's just so far beyond what many of us can imagine? I mean, Many of these rock formations are massive. What are the implications of melted cities forming mountains and large boulders? You can even start to consider whether this was done on purpose to hide this knowledge. This would be done because if the ancients were far more advanced than we've been taught in the education systems, we would have to rewrite our history and consider what happened to make these structures turn into solid stone. This would then lead to the conclusion of advanced technology and/or deadly cataclysms that petrified these structures into stone. This is something that the elite do not want the masses to know, and most likely was kept secret long ago. Now when we look around, we see that something doesn't quite add up. Many rock formations that seem to be man-made, but are explained as natural occurrences. Not all these petrified remains were turned into dwellings, but everywhere we look around the world, we can see the remnants of artifacts that were turned into stone. The question is, do we still have the eyes to see it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you know of any more ancient cave dwellings that look melted? What's your theory on what happened? Hope you guys enjoy this one, and if you get a chance, come check out the Discord. It's growing very fast, and I know some of you may not be familiar, but it's super easy to set up, and it's a great way to grow connections and research with other like-minded individuals. We also have some fun and do movie nights on the weekends, so don't miss out. Stay curious, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?